Hey homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. Today we are making corned beef brisket. I'm starting out with the salt that I need for the brine, and this is going to be a total of 2.5% salt, and that is based on the weight of the meat and also the weight of the brine itself, which is 3 quarts. I'm working in grams here because it's much easier to do the math in grams. Adding that to 2 quarts of water that's on the stove. The 3rd quart will be in ice later. I'm also using a curing salt or a pink salt with this recipe. It brings a lot to the table in terms of both flavor and color. If you want a corned beef brisket that is the classic pink color that you're used to seeing, you definitely need to add some of this curing salt to the brine. The recipe I'm using here is a combination of one by Alton Brown and then another one by Michael Ruhlman, plus information that I've learned off of charcuterie groups online. We're going to be adding some brown sugar to this brine as well. And I'm using a 2% brown sugar out of the total weight of the brine and the meat together. And that's kind of halfway in between the Ruhlman recipe and the Alton Brown recipe. It seemed like a good place to start. By the way, those clay discs that you keep in your brown sugar bag to keep it from getting hard, they totally work. I've been using one for years and I never have hard brown sugar. So everything in the pot, give it a nice stir. And we've got some heat going underneath this. We're also going to add some of our spices, and the heat is going to help bloom those flavors so that they really permeate the meat. These are the juniper berries from my own yard. Juniper berries, if you pick them when they're darker in color, are more ripe and have a little bit more sweetness to them. And then this is a homemade pickling mix that I put together based on a recipe from Michael Ruhlman. I'll put a link to that with all of the ingredients in the description below. Bring that to a nice simmer, give it a good stir, and then let it cool before you start adding it to the meat. So this is half of a brisket. We split a cow between 4 people this fall, and there are 2 briskets on a cow. The point and the flat are usually the 2 different pieces that one brisket is divided up into. This, I believe, is the flat just based on the shape. The flat is usually more square. It often also has a little bit more fat on it. This is really nicely trimmed. Sometimes you need to cut some of that fat off of the top portion. And we've got a quart of ice in this bucket. We're adding our brine to it. So that's 2 quarts of brine adding to a 3rd quart of ice. Our brine is fairly cooled at this point. We have let it sit on the stove for quite a while. And then, of course, that ice is going to bring the temperature way down. I decided there was no way that was easily going to fit in that container, and so I'm going to split this brisket in half. By the way, those containers come from a restaurant supply store. They're often called Cambros, and they are fantastic. They're kind of a pain to store because they take up a lot of room, but they are really great for projects like this, and I have them both in round and square sizes. So we're getting everybody into the brine here. I had to move things around to get everything submerged. You want it to stay under the liquid. And the type of process I'm using here is called equilibrium curing. And that is where you leave the meat in the brine long enough that it reaches an equilibrium where the salt is no longer going into the meat. It's where it's going to be forever. That way you don't have to worry about accidentally leaving something a day too long and having it be unedibly too salty. It's a great method, and it's also what I use for bacon. I highly recommend it. I have a video on bacon as well. We're going to put a lid on this and store it in my garage, which happens to be running at about 40 degrees, and give it a week to 10 days, and we'll be ready to cook it. Happy New Year, you guys. Got my corned beef here. If I can get the lid off of this thing. There we go. So this corned beef has been going a little over a week. I put it in here on the 23rd of December. It's now the 2nd of January. And you'll notice that the brine generally for corned beef is higher than it is for something like bacon. And that is because you're going to be boiling it in liquid for a long period of time. And so some of that salt is going to be lost. Versus when you do bacon, obviously you're cooking it as is. And so whatever the salt is in there is what you're going to be tasting. And so you can do a higher salt brine on something like this than you can on a bacon and not have it turn out to be too salty. So now we need to cover this with water. We're gonna get this going. And this cooks for a total of about 3 hours. I am gonna add cabbage and potatoes, but I'm gonna wait until this has been cooking for a couple of hours before I do that, because I don't want that to be a completely sogged out mess. And we're gonna add a little bit more pickling spices to our water. A couple more tablespoons is what my original recipe calls for. All right, we'll let that come to a boil and we'll be back. All right, you can see this is just at a simmer, which is what we want. And that meat has already shrunk up a little bit. So we're gonna do this, simmer this for a total of 3 hours, but I'm gonna set a timer for 2. And then we'll add potatoes and cabbage to the mix, and I'll probably stir this and flip these over at least once during that time. Lovely corned beef has been simmering for about 2 hours. And I am gonna add in some potatoes from my garden. I might have to take off some of that broth. Some carrots, not from my garden. And then some cabbage. That is a mix of local and my own garden, which is kind of amazing considering that it is January. So some of this cabbage has been in my garage since October, perhaps. That's pretty good. I'm gonna put the lid back on this, so this is gonna kind of steam. We don't really need the cabbage to be super down in there because it's gonna cook pretty easily. Slide that back, give that at least another hour, and hopefully it'll be time for dinner. So this is after the 3rd hour, our cabbage is cooked. And if you look at our meat here, see how that's flaking? That's kind of what we want. We don't want it to be completely falling apart, but we want to see some nice shredding there. That's a pretty good indication that it's ready. And then I'm just gonna test out. Yep, that carrot is done. I think we're golden. It's time for dinner. So when you slice this, you want to slice it against the grain. So the grain is going this way. So we're cutting across that. That's what it means to do against the grain. And that's going to make it really easy to break off small bites with a fork. All right, tribe, I'm gonna keep this short because we've got guests coming over for dinner, but here you go. Corned beef with cabbage, potatoes, and carrots, homemade from a local brisket, from a local beef. Really easy and less expensive than buying it at the store, already made. And you can control all the flavors that go into it. Super delicious. I'm gonna have a little bite here. So good. Not over-salted. Perfect. It's gonna make great sandwiches too. So give this a try. Definitely a worthy home project. It seems like it's gonna be super complicated, and it's really not. So corned beef and cabbage, make your own. Thanks for watching, tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, drop me a comment, and please subscribe. We'll see you next week.